If you're a fan of Community, you may or may not be aware of the show's tumultuous history. To be blunt, it's basically a miracle that it ran for 6 seasons. A miracle that was largely thanks to the dedicated fans who didn't want to say goodbye to the characters they've grown to love over the years. It goes without saying, but Community wasn't exactly the kind of show that brought in good ratings, and given that NBC and television as a whole weren't in a great place around that time, with networks constantly losing ground to the growing streaming market and piracy, a problem that has only worsened since, and the industry has failed to keep up with it, leading us to the point where it feels like we're now seeing a new streaming service announced every month, including NBC's own upcoming Peacock service, which will retain the exclusive rights to The Office, which has consistently been one of Netflix's most streamed shows since forever. Also, NBC, please don't cancel AP Bio again, I need Victor in my life. Even though Community was never the runaway success NBC had hoped for, they still kept going. It's hard to say whether it's because it had such a dedicated but small audience, or if the network simply didn't have anything they were confident could be more successful to fill the void it left behind. Both seem plausible, especially since many of the new shows, most famously Outsourced, were massive flops that failed to find an audience. By the time Community reached the end of its 3rd season, it was assumed by audiences and everyone involved in the show's production that the series was coming to an end. The finale, aptly titled Introduction to Finality, was shot with the intention of being a possible ending to the show while also leaving the door open for future storylines, in hopes that it would return for a 4th season, which fortunately it did for a 13-episode run, but without showrunner and creator Dan Harmon, who was fired by Sony Pictures due to his increasingly problematic behavior, including excessive drinking, disappearances, and procrastinating. Various other personnel also departed the show before the 4th season started airing, most notably writer and actor Dinos Stamatopoulos, aka Starburns, and Chris McKenna, who wrote the season 3 episode Remedial Chaos Theory, which earned him a nomination for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Writing for a Comedy Series, and is considered by many to be the best episode in the entire series. After the mediocre reception of season 4, which was later dubbed the gas leak year by the characters in the show who would routinely ignore the events which occurred during it, it was assumed that the show was dead once again, with another finale designed to be another potential end. Alongside this, Chevy Chase's relationship with the cast and crew had deteriorated beyond repair. He was butting heads constantly with seemingly everyone. Even before Harmon's departure, there were constant complaints about his behavior towards his co-stars, including sexist remarks towards the women of the show and racist remarks towards the people of color. Chase made very few appearances in the 4th season of the show and was completely absent for 2 episodes.
Wait, who's Pierce? I know he's not with us, but is he still with us?
I'm sure he's fine.
His departure was unceremonious, and his death later on was from embarrassing causes, although he was given a somewhat touching send-off. Despite the decline in quality and viewership, Community returned for a 5th season with a reduced episode order of 13 episodes once again. It was also the final season to air on NBC. Dan Harmon was hired to helm this creation once again, and McKenna and Stamatopoulos returned to their previous roles. John Oliver also returned after a 2-year absence from the show, and his character Professor Ian Duncan had more of a presence than he did previously. The show was once again critically acclaimed and returned to the quality standard that was set during Harmon's previous season. However, all that glitters isn't gold, and season 5 brought with it new challenges, most notably losing Donald Glover from the cast, who left to pursue his own projects. Despite this, the show carried on and is still considered by many to be among the best seasons. At this point, those involved with the show, be they fans or those involved in the production, were ready for the worst. Having seen Community die and be revived over and over again, it came to no surprise that despite the resurgence in the show's quality, in May 2014 it was finally cancelled by NBC. There were no false alarms and no reprieves this time. It was over. Of course, fans of the show across the world voiced their opinion and begged for the show to come back, but NBC wanted to move on, and I think it's safe to say that at this point, the production wanted to move away from NBC too. Around this time though, Netflix was in the early days of producing its own original content, one of which was the surprising resurrection of Arrested Development, another legendary sitcom which had troubles staying on air much like Community did. Arrested Development's new season premiered back in 2013, but the show had been long dead before that, having last aired on Fox back in 2006. Community, however, was still fresh on people's minds. It was a well-established sitcom that generally brought in a decent audience, and Netflix was clearly taking its best shot at the old-fashioned and outdated model of the traditional television network. People thought that surely, if Community had any chance at another season, it would be thanks to Netflix. But as we know now, that wasn't the case. They turned it down, along with Hulu, and Community was considered dead. The fans' dream of 6 seasons and a movie had come to an end. 2 months after the cancellation of Community, a miracle happened. Despite being turned down by major streaming services and no interest from other networks, the show was given its biggest reprieve yet. On June 30th, 2014, the day the cast's contracts were expiring, it was announced that Community would be returning for a 6th season on the brand new streaming service, Yahoo Screen. Never heard of it before? I don't blame you. It was Yahoo's short-lived and ill-fated attempt at getting in on a streaming game, which failed miserably. But nonetheless, it stepped up when fans of the show needed it the most, by delivering 13 more episodes and giving us a proper goodbye from the Greendale gang. When the show finally returned in March 2015 though, we learned that things weren't quite going to be the same as they were before. It goes without saying, but obviously there will be spoilers ahead as we look back on Community's weird and wonderful final season.
Welcome back to Greendale, now ranked 5th on Colorado's alphabetical listing of community colleges.
Before season 6 even began, the show had experienced yet another loss of major character. After Yvette Nicole Brown, who played Shirley, left the show to care for her father. She made a couple of brief appearances in the first and final episode of the season, but obviously this wasn't enough to fill the void left behind. Professor Hickey, played by Jonathan Banks, who joined the show's main cast in the 5th season, had also left, presumably to reprise his role as Mike Ehrmantraut in Better Call Saul, which had begun airing 1 month prior to the release of Community's 6th season. Given the ensemble's diminishing numbers, new characters were brought in an attempt to fill the gaps that had been created. Paget Brewster and Keith David joined as Frankie Dart and Elroy Potashnik, respectively, and Ken Jeong as Ben Chang returned as a full-time member of the group. Before season 6, Community felt very much like a network sitcom. Colourful characters and sets, quickly paced scenes, choppy editing, and a somewhat bubbly soundtrack that would be present in most episodes. The sharp writing and multi-layered characters existed throughout the 5-season run, and they changed in subtle yet important ways over time. These are some of the major reasons why Community stood out amongst its peers. It was approachable as a sitcom, but it rewarded audiences for paying attention. Around the time the show was first airing, The Big Bang Theory was also on CBS and had reached a 3rd season. Although the show had foregone the typical cast of characters you'd seen in American sitcom, at its core it was still traditional in its format. Characters barely ever changed beyond forming new relationships, be they temporary or long-standing. If they were to find new careers, it wouldn't alter them in any kind of profound way, and as writing goes, there was barely any deviation from the tropes it had established early on into its run. In other words, those bazinga jokes appeared multiple times in every season for 12 whole seasons. Now, to be clear, I'm not dunking on you if you like The Big Bang Theory. If you enjoyed it, then more power to you. But I mentioned the show to illustrate what the landscape of comedy on television was like at the time Community was airing. Although The Big Bang Theory was in some ways different, it was a traditional sitcom, barely distinguishable from Chuck Lorre's other massive success, 2.5 Men. Because it was so traditional, it was familiar, and people loved the familiar. Community, on the other hand, was not. The first season might have been to some extent, but as it went on it became clear that it wasn't your traditional sitcom, and it wasn't interested in being one. And the only familiarity you'd get from it is when it was willing to dive into parodies or break the fourth wall by pointing at tropes you're already aware of. At the end of season 5, Greendale had ostensibly been fixed, after the group established a committee to identify and solve its many flaws. But when we return, we're quickly reminded that at this place, a crisis is always around the corner. Greendale Community College is a ridiculous place that attracts ridiculous and broken people, those who have lost their direction and want it back, or at the very least to be a part of a story, and as Abed said in previous episodes,
No! It's always a story! Everything is a story!
in the early days of Community, Jeff and sometimes Britta often served as the outsiders of sort who would recognize the ludicrous situations they were in, but despite that they always managed to somehow get involved. At this point in the story though, they had both learned to embrace everything that makes Greendale so bizarre and wonderful, thus leaving the group without anyone to keep them grounded. So in steps Frankie Dart, a sensible, accomplished woman who wants to achieve the best results for her employer while keeping everyone focused on what matters the most, keeping Greendale afloat. She does have some questionable taste in literature though. I mean, look at that, come on. As a sensible outsider, Frankie could potentially be considered a surrogate for audiences new to the show. She's a normal person who has to work her way into this group of strange people who constantly involve themselves in even stranger situations. This could have been the makers of Community attempting to explain to those new to the show that although what's happening is unusual, it's still not accepted as normal by all, that they're self-aware of the show's absurdity, and if you were to pick one defining trait of Community, it would be self-awareness.
You're not the new Annie. You're the new Abed.
Don't know what that means yet.
Elroy's inclusion was another reminder of how Greendale is a place that attracts lost souls. He's a programmer who's living in an RV, selling his outdated technology to gullible people and creating knockoff versions of popular apps. As far as I can tell, his presence in the show didn't serve any particular purpose other than filling in the gaps left behind by previous cast members, but he also did illustrate the kind of people that Greendale attracts, especially since he embraced the situations they found themselves in and didn't tend to question things. If there's one word I could use to describe the 6th season of Community, it would be darker. When I say this, I don't mean that it took a turn and became a dark exploration into these characters' psyches like a show such as Moral Oral, but it was less inclined to adhere to the jovial aesthetic that underscored the show for the 5 seasons that preceded it. I think it's fair to say that at this point, Community might have become truer to the show that Dan Harmon intended it to be. A very funny show with a lot of warmth, but also willing to explore the parts of its characters most sitcoms wouldn't even dream of doing. That behind every type of character you might be accustomed to, there's a history that formed them into who they are, and that can sometimes be painful or downright heartbreaking. It's understandable that a network like NBC might not have wanted to make audiences who watch sitcoms for escapism feel uncomfortable, but the idea that a sitcom or comedy as a whole is obligated to be funny and heartwarming almost all the time is frankly outdated. And speaking as someone who grew up on British comedy, I've always been open to the idea of exploring the truly awful sides of comedy characters. It's what some of our most beloved sitcoms have done best. At this point in the series, all of these characters know each other intimately. They've seen each other at their worst and at their best, but mostly at their worst. But they stay close because they know that regardless of how much they butt heads, they're aware they all have their flaws and insecurities, and that people aren't two-dimensional, even though it's comforting for us to believe that they are. Take for example episode 4, titled Queer Studies and Advanced Waxing, where the A story is about how Dean Pelton is given a promotion. The school board had recently cancelled a gay pride parade, so in order to improve their optics, they give Dean a more powerful position under the assumption that he's gay. He accepts it since he's been desperate for success since the beginning of the show, but the circumstances behind it are obviously less than favourable. The Dean is not gay, and even though the show doesn't actually define his sexuality, if we were to put a label on it, the Dean could be considered queer or pansexual. Even though before this we've been made aware of the Dean's spectrum of attraction, the show hasn't really delved into the complexity of human sexuality and indeed how it can be weaponized by those in power. American network television hasn't got the best track record when it comes to discussing and portraying sexuality. Vast amounts of people aren't very aware of the broad spectrum of sexuality, largely due to how this spectrum is represented in media. In sitcoms or dramas that you'll find on the likes of NBC, there's a good chance that if there is a queer character, then they'll more than likely be lesbian, gay, or bisexual, but rarely anything beyond that. I think this is one of the things that made Season 6 of Community strange though, and I use strange in a good way. It was a comedy that took the time to explore this spectrum in a character that was originally sidelined for comic relief. Ben Chang is another great example of how Season 6 took characters that existed for comic relief and seamlessly gave them more depth. Even though throughout the majority of the season he was the unhinged person that we'd known, in the same episode he gets a role in the Karate Kid play and learn that he has a pain that he's able to channel into an incredible performance. Both the Dean and Chang went through awful experiences to reach their epiphany, the former being paraded around through the media circus for PR purposes, and the latter being shouted at and abused by a director. But a lesson the show gave us was that we shouldn't underestimate people. No matter how different they are to you, they still have something to offer, and that humans are far more complex than we imagine them to be. Even though Season 6 of Community retreaded on old territory, including paintball, it managed to do so while feeling fresh and often having more to say than they did before. In Season 3 Episode 13 there was a storyline of Britta dating Rick, also known as Subway since he was the living personification of a sandwich restaurant who was created by the corporation to give them human form. This entire episode contained product placement from Subway, but Harmon and his team masterfully lampooned the idea of inserting advertising into art and comedy. In Season 6, Rick returns, but once again he's a corporate tool, now playing a guerrilla marketing agent for Honda. To me this always seemed like a compromise between the creator and the network. Even though we're laughing at the very concept of someone's entire personality being repurposed to fit the corporate narrative to make the most affable human being one can imagine, at the end of the day it is still marketing a product, and regardless of the fact that the show made fun of it, you will remember Honda by the name of the episode. And in the greatest stroke of irony, isn't that just another form of guerrilla marketing?
Some so subtle you might not have even noticed, but your brain did.
Thematically it was similar to the Subway episode, but it felt like what it had to say was delivered in a smarter way. That we may live alongside advertising, but it does have an insidious intention to sell to you and to make you want something regardless of whether you can afford it. Because of this, by comparison to the Season 3 episode, Season 6's darker tone gave us more space to feel something for the people at the mercy of this corporation. Rick has to survive somehow, and he's doing a job that he's good at, that presumably pays well. It's just the one thing that's keeping him from the woman who loves him. There were some episodes that seemed like they existed just to indulge the goofiness the show had been known for at times too, such as Grifting 101, in which the man with the golden voice, Matt Berry, taught a class on how to grift people, which leads to a series of elaborate and over-the-top heists. Laws of robotics and party rights, where prisoners participate in classes via remote-controlled tablets and one of them tries to kill Jeff.
Did you just try to murder me?
And Intro to Recycled Cinema, where after Chang becomes famous, they attempt to capitalize on his success by using sparse amounts of footage they own of him to make a sci-fi movie. Although this did serve as a commentary on what it can be like for a creator that gets too attached to their work and doesn't want to sacrifice parts of it in order to appeal to audiences, regardless of how terrible the product might be. Another way Season 6 bucked the trend of traditional sitcoms and even itself was that it didn't really have many side stories. Most sitcoms will have what's called an A story, B story, and sometimes C story. As a quick example, take the recent episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine titled Admiral Peralta. The A story, or main story, is Jake attempting to help his dad and grandfather reconcile. The B story is Amy and Rosa taking on a high-profile case, and the C story is Holt teaching Terry how to play the flute. The majority of Community's Season 6 episodes, however, tended to either have very minor B stories or only an A story, and as a result it gave the plotlines more room to breathe. It also allowed for all the characters to be involved in some capacity. Usually the B story and the C story exist to help with pacing. Going from one story to another can offer some satisfying diversity, so if one story isn't doing it for you, at the very least you don't have to wait too long to try another, and given that your typical sitcom has a runtime of 21 minutes, it's not a long wait. It also allows us to experience a variety of character combinations each week, so writers can experiment with character dynamics.
Why did they pair us together?
Community waited a long time to move away from this formula, and it paid off, because at this point we knew pretty much all the combinations of character dynamics available, and these were available even while part of the whole group. There were a handful of episodes in the past seasons that focused on one storyline, but these were largely parody episodes, whereas the majority of Season 6's episodes will take a single thread and pull it till the end. If I were to pick a handful of episodes that demonstrated the tonal shift and its willingness to explore more difficult subjects in Season 6 of Community, it'd probably have to be Episode 6, Basic Email Security, Episode 12, Wedding Videography, and the final episode titled Emotional Consequences of Broadcast Television. In Basic Email Security, the entirety of Greendale had their emails hacked and leaked after they refused to bow to the demands of the hacker who demanded that they cancel the campus performance of a controversial comedian. The vulnerabilities of Greendale's networks led to the vulnerabilities of the gang being exposed, and they learned that even though they may be as close as friends can get, there's still things that they might not be saying. From the deep insecurities that people cope with that they feel are too tragic to share, to the offhand comments we make about other people's behaviour or appearance that we wouldn't want to tell them to their face, even if it's just to protect them. It showed that despite knowing someone on a deeper level, there may still be things left unsaid, and perhaps best left unsaid. In Wedding Videography, we see the group prepare for the unexpected wedding of longtime side character Garrett. It's another documentary-style episode shot by Abed, and another masterful character study from the show. At first it seems as though the episode is simply documenting the group getting prepared for the wedding without much else being at stake, until it turns out they're running late. Once they arrive, they learn that they might not be as lovable as they thought they were after an extremely passive-aggressive indictment from Garrett's mother, reminding them that this day isn't about them. It's a very uncomfortable moment, but it's a welcome dose of realism you don't often see in comedy. It was a subversion of the idea that everything in the show doesn't necessarily have to be about the protagonists, and even served as a lesson that big moments in other people's lives don't exist for you to give yourself a platform. There was also the reveal that Garrett and his new bride Stacy were cousins several times removed, and even though this would usually be fertile territory for a comedy to make jokes at the expense of them, it took the opportunity to talk about how love can be a complicated thing, and how you can't just force yourself not to love someone after something like this. And of all people, it was the sentiment delivered by Ben Chang, and Ken Jeong's performance is amazing in this part.
It's you against the world and you will not win, but you get to make your moves, not them.
Then, to close the episode, there's a statement from the writer of the episode telling us how incest laws are unfair and that being in a relationship with your cousin should be legal, and that they could only do this episode if he was willing to be credited as the sole writer and record this statement at the end of the show to close it. Yeah, Season 6 got really weird at times.
I'm Briggs Hatton. I wrote the Community Season 6 incest episode.
Then came the final episode of Community, the one where the characters had to move on, and so did the audience. The semester is over, the group have once again saved Greendale, and they're at the bar to celebrate. After 6 years, or 6 seasons, they're at a loss for what's to come, and ask Abed what's in store for Season 7, to which he admits he doesn't think there's going to be one, noting that they've been hemorrhaging characters and the formula has been changed way too many times. So to solve this problem, the group then starts pitching their own ideas for a possible new season. Each of their visions are some variation on how audiences have perceived the show, and attempt to recreate the parts which we're most familiar with in the hopes that it will restore the show to its supposed former glory. At first, Jeff isn't too keen on the idea of creating a narrative just because it's familiar and comforting, but then 2 bombs are dropped, in the form of Annie leaving to begin an internship, and Abed moving to become the writer of a sitcom. Jeff becomes filled with dread at the idea of being left behind by those closest to him, and that the pain of change and loss is inevitable, so he begins joining in and pitching ideas for a new season. It seems like he's just joining in with the group at first, but then it becomes clear that it's not just a pitch. He needs it, because he wants them all to stay in his life for as long as possible. But that's not how this works, and it's not how life works. People move on, and sometimes you have to stay behind. And the only thing you know about the future for certain is that someone you love won't be in it as much as they were, or even at all. It's not unusual for the final days of a sitcom to contain emotionally wrought moments. I don't think I'm alone when I say that in general it can be harder to say goodbye to a beloved sitcom than something like a drama. And I think that's because even though you can become attached to characters in a drama, it's not always the case where all of them bring you joy. With a sitcom like Community, these characters might be at times goofy and might find themselves in ridiculous situations, but one thing it excelled at was making us, as the audience, see ourselves in its characters, especially the parts of us that we don't like to believe exist. The parts that are vulnerable and flawed, but it also made you consider that it's not bad to be broken in some way, because it makes you who you are, and you can still love and be loved regardless. In this last episode, Jeff realized that even though over the last 6 years he's tried to make everyone around him aware that he wants to be left alone, he truly doesn't, and that having these people around has made his life better, and a good piece of art can make your life better too, even if it's just a critically acclaimed, underwatched NBC/Yahoo screen sitcom that's been cancelled more times than Dave Chappelle for telling his crappy transphobic jokes. Ultimately, I think this is what the final season of Community was trying to tell us, that we need to move on. Even if season 6 was a resounding success, which, to be clear, it was never going to be because anything on Yahoo's screen was destined to die, it would have more than likely ended there because it was time. And not just because the season 6 part of 6 seasons and a movie prophecy had been fulfilled. Saying goodbye to the people you love is painful. I'm gonna get a little personal here, but around 4 years ago, I moved to another country to live with my wife, leaving family and friends and an entire life behind in order to begin a new one. And it was easily the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Not a day goes by where I don't think of my old life. Simple things like seeing someone you know in the flesh and talking to them by just walking into another room or driving 10 minutes to meet them aren't possible anymore. Those are the kind of things that you take for granted until they're no longer an option. And that's what it can be like when a show you love comes to an end. That half hour you'd put aside each week to watch it is suddenly empty, and nothing's going to fill that void. I think Community's finale captured that feeling of impending loss perfectly. And whenever I watch it, I get reminded of how it feels to lose those things you care about so much, but have to let go of anyway, even when it's out of your control. The existence of season 6 of Community is a small miracle unto itself. It may have been super weird and at times darker than we expected, but it was also a wonderful ending. It was able to deliver a heartfelt goodbye and at the same time let you know that the people who made the show were going to miss you just as much as you'll miss them. But try as you might, we have to accept that the things and people we love will eventually move on, regardless of how much we love them.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing and leaving a like. And if you feel like it, why not tell me what you loved about Community too, and if you'd like to see a movie for it. If you want to check out some other videos on this channel, you should see them now, but otherwise, take care of yourself and please stay indoors.